The first time I tried to speak up, I did it carefully. I wasn't reckless. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply asked questions during a routine review meeting, about the inconsistencies in patient charts, about symptoms that didn't line up with the published trial data. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with professionalism and everything to do with warning. One of the senior physicians cleared his throat and changed the subject. Another avoided my eyes entirely. And Mr. Thorne, who wasn't even supposed to be in that meeting, leaned back in his chair and smiled at me like I was a curious child who'd wandered into an adult conversation. "These trials are being monitored at the highest level," he said smoothly. "St. Jude's reputation depends on it. So did mine," I realized. And that was the leverage. After that, doors closed more quickly when I approached. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Charts that were once easy to access suddenly required authorization. I was praised publicly, called dedicated, tireless, while quietly being edged out of anything related to Prometheus. It was subtle, professional, almost elegant, but I'd already seen too much. Late nights became my refuge. When the halls were empty and the machines hummed softly, I started keeping my own records. Nothing dramatic, just dates, symptoms, dosage changes, recovery setbacks that never made it into the official summaries. Patterns began to form, ugly and undeniable. Patients who questioned the drug were labeled non-compliant. Those whose conditions worsened were quietly transferred or discharged early. And the reports sent back to the pharmaceutical company? Polished, optimistic, sanitized. The breaking point came with Mrs. Davies. She grabbed my wrist one evening, her fingers weak but desperate. "They won't listen," she whispered. "They keep telling me it's normal. But I don't feel like myself anymore." Neither did I that night. I went home and couldn't sleep. The hospital I loved, the place I had given my life to, was no longer just a place of healing. It had become a stage, and patients were paying the price for a performance designed to impress investors and shareholders. I understood then what Mr. Thorne truly meant when he talked about the future of medicine. It wasn't about people, it was about numbers, and I had a choice. I could stay quiet, protect my career, let the machine keep running. Or I could become a problem. So I started copying files, backing up emails, saving versions of reports before they were revised. I knew the risks. Whistleblowers don't get thank you notes. They get isolated, discredited, erased. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the look in my patient's eyes, that quiet fear, that unspoken plea. If St. Jude's had a heartbeat, it was still there. And I wasn't going to let it flatline in silence. I prayed before I moved. Not the kind of prayer people say out loud to sound righteous, but the quiet kind. The kind you whisper when you already know obedience will cost you something. I asked for wisdom, not comfort. For courage, not applause. And clarity, because I knew the wrong move could bury the truth forever. The answer didn't come as a voice. It came as resolve. I stopped trying to convince the people who had already decided not to see. Instead, I started preparing. I documented everything with precision. Dates, dosages, before and after assessments, nurses' notes that mysteriously vanished from official records, internal emails that spoke one language publicly and another privately. I learned quickly which systems logged edits, which timestamps could be traced, which accidental errors happened a little too often to be accidents. And I learned something else. Truth leaves fingerprints. The more I dug, the clearer it became that Prometheus wasn't just flawed, it was being protected. Adverse reactions were reclassified. Withdrawals from the trial were reframed as unrelated complications. A statistic here, a footnote there, and suddenly suffering disappeared on paper. But bodies don't lie. One evening, I ran into Dr. Evans again in the corridor. He looked older somehow, tired, like a man carrying a weight he pretended not to feel. He asked me, casually, too casually, what I was working on these days. I told him the truth, wrapped in politeness. Patient outcomes, I said. The whole story. He held my gaze for a moment too long, then nodded. Be careful, he said softly. That was the closest thing to a confession I was going to get. The pressure increased after that. My schedule changed. My access narrowed. I was removed from the Prometheus ward, temporarily. Compliments turned into evaluations. Evaluations turned into warnings. Nothing overt, nothing illegal, just enough to remind me how easily a career could be dismantled. Mr. Thorne passed me in the lobby one afternoon, his smile sharp as ever. You're very passionate, he said, like it was both praise and threat. Passion can be exhausting. I smiled back. So is watching people suffer in silence. His eyes hardened for just a second. That's when I knew I was on the right path. The nurses began to trust me more openly. One slipped me a handwritten log she'd kept for weeks. Another quietly confirmed a dosage change that had never been approved by the oversight board. These weren't rebels. These were professionals who had reached the same breaking point I had. We weren't reckless. We were careful, patient, strategic, because this wasn't just about exposing a bad drug. It was about dismantling a lie that had wrapped itself in prestige and money and authority. It was about reminding a powerful system that no reputation is worth more than a human life. I didn't know yet who would listen. A journalist, a regulator, an ethics board. I only knew this. When light finally hit what was hiding in the shadows, it would be blinding. St. Jude's still stood tall from the outside. Glass gleaming, awards framed on the walls. But underneath, its soul was at war. And I had chosen my side. This wasn't the end of my silence. It was the beginning of my testimony. The moment I realized the truth had weight, I stopped treating it like a secret and started treating it like evidence. Not rumors, not feelings, evidence. I organized everything, quietly, meticulously. I created timelines that showed when Prometheus was introduced and how patient outcomes shifted afterward. I highlighted dosage changes that never triggered proper review. I paired clinical data with first-hand accounts, anonymized but unmistakably human. A chart could show a decline, but a nurse's note about a patient forgetting her own child's name made that decline impossible to dismiss. And here's the thing they didn't count on. Systems are built by people, and people leave patterns. Emails contradicted reports. Drafts told different stories than final submissions. Language softened where it shouldn't have. Words like severe became moderate. Concerning became noteworthy. Suffering didn't disappear, it was edited. The more I compiled, the clearer the shape of the truth became. This wasn't negligence born of ignorance. This was willful blindness, encouraged by money, prestige, and the intoxicating idea of being first in medical history. I knew better than to march into the boardroom waving papers like a warning flag. That would have gotten me escorted out before lunchtime. No, this required precision. Timing. The right audience. So I identified the pressure points. Every institution has them. There were external ethics reviewers whose names were attached to the trial but whose involvement was mostly ceremonial. There was a regulatory body that only saw what it was sent, and trusted that St. Jude's wouldn't tarnish its own legacy. And there was one investigative journalist, known for medical accountability stories, who had quietly questioned a different pharmaceutical trial the year before. I didn't send everything at once. I sent enough. Enough to spark curiosity. Enough to make someone ask, why hasn't this been reported? Enough to force a closer look. Meanwhile, the hospital atmosphere shifted. You could feel it, like the air before a storm. Meetings got shorter. Smiles got tighter. Mr. Thorne stopped pretending I didn't exist. Dr. Evans avoided me entirely. And yet, something else changed too. Patients' families started asking better questions. Nurses stood a little straighter. A resident slipped and said, I thought you should know, more than once. Truth has a way of giving people courage when they realize they're not standing alone. I wasn't naive. I knew retaliation might come. Reviews, reassignments, concerns about my judgment. But I had already crossed the point of no return. Once you see clearly, you can't unsee. Once you know, silence becomes complicity. I wasn't fighting for attention. I was fighting for accountability. And deep down, beneath the fear and fatigue, there was peace. Not comfort, but peace. The kind that comes when your actions finally align with your calling. The truth was no longer whispering. It was standing upright, documented, organized, and ready. And soon, very soon, it would knock on doors much bigger than mine. That day. That's the part people don't talk about, how truth rarely brings instant verdicts. What it brings first is discomfort. And discomfort, when it settles into powerful rooms, has a way of rearranging priorities. The ethics board thanked me. Carefully, formally. They said they would review the materials, that they would initiate an internal inquiry, that patient safety was paramount. Words I'd heard before, but this time, something underneath them felt different. Less rehearsed, less certain. Dr. Evans didn't meet my eyes as we left the room. Within a week, subtle things started happening. Prometheus enrollments slowed, not stopped, slowed. A request came down for additional documentation on adverse events. Nurses were asked to submit supplemental reports, this time without the usual discouraging sighs or raised eyebrows. A previously postponed audit was suddenly back on the calendar. And then came the call. Not from the board, from compliance. They wanted clarification on discrepancies I'd referenced, specifically, why internal summaries didn't align with raw patient data. They asked how I had accessed certain drafts. I answered honestly, calmly. I hadn't hacked anything. I hadn't stolen. I'd simply paid attention. Attention, it turns out, is dangerous. Mr. Thorne reappeared soon after, like a storm cloud in an expensive suit. He requested a private conversation. Framed it as concern. You've put the hospital in a difficult position, he said smoothly. Innovation always comes with turbulence. I didn't argue. I just said, so does ignoring harm. That conversation ended quickly. The pressure ramped up after that, but so did the scrutiny. External reviewers were brought in to reassure stakeholders. That reassurance required data, real data, unedited data, and once outsiders start asking questions, control becomes a lot harder to maintain. Patients' families were notified of a temporary pause on certain dosages. A pause, not an admission, but pauses save lives just the same. Mrs. Davies was taken off Prometheus and slowly, achingly, began to stabilize. Not fully, not miraculously, but enough to confirm what my spirit had known long before the spreadsheets caught up. The nurses noticed too. They didn't say much, just small nods in the hallway. A hand on my arm. A quiet, thank you. I knew retaliation might still come. Institutions don't like mirrors held too close. Careers can be rewritten. Narratives can be reshaped. I could still be labeled difficult, disruptive, uncollaborative. But something irreversible had happened. The lie had been interrupted. Truth doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes like a crack in glass, small, almost polite. But once it's there, pressure does the rest. The crack spreads. Slowly, surely. St. Jude's was still standing. Still gleaming from the outside. But inside, something sacred had stirred awake. And whether they liked it or not, the conscience of the building had found its voice again. This wasn't the end. It was the moment the system realized it was being watched, not by the public, not by investors, but by truth itself. After my meeting with Dr. Sharma, I understood something crucial. Institutions don't fall from a single blow. They fracture from sustained pressure applied in the right places. Dr. Sharma didn't promise me anything. She didn't need to. The way she asked her questions told me everything. She wasn't looking for reassurance, she was looking for verification. And people like that don't stop once they start digging. Within days, she requested independent access to the raw trial data. Not the curated summaries, not the polished slides prepared for donors and executives. The raw numbers, the kind no one looks at unless they expect to find something wrong. That request alone sent ripples through the hospital. Suddenly, meetings were being rescheduled. Emails were being clarified. Dr. Evans became more visible, more vocal, pushing urgency, warning about derailing years of work. The louder he spoke, the more obvious it became. He wasn't defending science anymore, he was defending a narrative. And narratives crack when questioned from the inside. I noticed compliance officers walking the halls more often. A locked cabinet in the research wing was suddenly unlocked. Nurses were encouraged to submit addendums to previous reports. That word alone told me everything had shifted. Encouragement meant protection. It meant someone higher up had decided silence was no longer the safest option. Dr. Sharma wasn't acting alone either. Ethics boards rarely do. She brought in a biostatistician from outside the hospital, someone with no ties to St. Jude's, no loyalty to Prometheus, no stake in anyone's reputation. Just numbers and integrity. And the numbers? They told the truth. Clusters that were statistically impossible to ignore. Adverse effects that exceeded acceptable thresholds once you removed the cosmetic exclusions. Recovery rates that only looked impressive because the worst outcomes had been quietly removed from the sample. You can manipulate a story. You can't manipulate math forever. The most telling moment came when a patient previously listed as withdrawn due to unrelated causes reappeared in the data, this time correctly categorized. That single correction shifted an entire outcome curve. One correction, one truth restored to its place. That's how fragile deception really is. Dr. Evans called me into his office shortly after. He tried a different tone this time, less dismissive, more paternal. He spoke about unity, about protecting the institution, about unintended consequences. He warned me, gently, about how history remembers troublemakers. I listened. Then I said, calmly, history doesn't remember the people who stayed quiet when they knew better. He didn't respond to that. By the end of the week, Prometheus trials were officially suspended, pending further review. The language was careful, neutral, bloodless, but I knew what it meant. The dam had cracked, not burst, but cracked. Patients were safer now than they had been weeks before. Nurses slept a little easier. Families were given information instead of reassurances. And somewhere deep within St. Jude's, the illusion of moral certainty had finally been disturbed. This wasn't victory, this was momentum. And momentum, once it starts moving, is far more dangerous to entrenched power than outrage ever could be. Because outrage burns hot and fast, but truth, applied steadily, reshapes the ground beneath everything. Dr. Evans's structure was still standing, but the fault lines were exposed, and the earth beneath it was no longer still. Dr. Evans didn't understand was this: restriction is a confession in slow motion. Every door he closed told the board which rooms mattered most. Every delay raised a question louder than any accusation I could have made. Power hates exposure, but it hates patterns even more, and by now, patterns were everywhere. Dr. Sharma brought those patterns into the light with surgical precision. In board meetings, she didn't point fingers. She asked questions no one could comfortably answer. Why were these adverse events reclassified after initial reporting? Why do nursing notes differ from the finalized trial summaries? Why were access privileges altered during an ongoing ethics review? Questions are dangerous. They don't accuse, but they invite scrutiny. And scrutiny was exactly what the system had been avoiding. The board began requesting parallel reviews, same data, different analysts. Same cases, different eyes. And when independent reviewers reached conclusions that mirrored my own findings, the narrative Dr. Evans had worked so hard to protect began to collapse under its own weight. Not dramatically, not publicly, but unmistakably, I noticed the change in how people spoke to me. Less dismissive, more cautious. Junior doctors began looping me into conversations again. Nurses stopped lowering their voices when I passed. Silence was being replaced with acknowledgement, and acknowledgement is the first step toward accountability. Dr. Evans, meanwhile, grew increasingly isolated. Authority only works when people believe in it, and belief was eroding. His arguments sounded thinner now, repeated too often, like lines memorized rather than lived. He still had position, but position without trust is just a title waiting to fall. The defining moment came when the board requested a formal response from his department addressing the discrepancies Dr. Sharma had identified. For the first time, he wasn't explaining things away in private memos. He was explaining them on record. And records have a way of outliving reputations. Prometheus remained suspended, not paused, not slowed, suspended. That single word carried more weight than any sermon I could preach. It meant the institution was no longer willing to gamble with uncertainty. It meant patient safety had reclaimed its place at the center of the conversation. I didn't celebrate. This wasn't a victory lap kind of moment. It was sobering, because what became clear was this: the problem wasn't just one drug, or one executive, or one department head. It was a system that had learned to reward silence and punish conscience. And systems don't change overnight. But they do change when people stop cooperating with the lie. Dr. Sharma and I never called ourselves allies. We didn't need to. Our alignment was evident in the work. In the questions asked. In the refusals to look away. In the shared understanding that ethics isn't a policy, it's a posture. The unveiling had begun, just as I knew it would. And once truth is no longer isolated, once it becomes shared, documented, and defended, it stops being fragile. It becomes inevitable. The formation of that independent committee changed everything. Not because justice had been served, no, not yet, but because control had shifted. Authority was no longer centralized in one department, one voice, one carefully curated narrative. It was dispersed, shared, and that terrified the people who had grown comfortable deciding which truths mattered. The committee's mandate was clear: unrestricted access. That phrase alone sent shockwaves through the hospital. Files that had been misplaced resurfaced. Archived emails were restored. Staffing records, turnover reports, and incident logs were pulled without warning. Nurses who had once feared retaliation were now protected under formal whistleblower provisions. For the first time, the system wasn't just listening, it was required to hear. Dr. Evans was placed on administrative leave during the investigation. Temporary, they said. Procedural, they insisted. But power doesn't like being paused. And a pause was exactly what this was. I watched him clear out his office one afternoon, box by box, his movements stiff, controlled. He didn't look at me. I didn't look away. There was no triumph in it. Only gravity. The kind that settles when consequences arrive, quiet but unavoidable. The investigation uncovered more than Prometheus. That's the thing about pulling one thread, you rarely like what unravels. There were funding pressures that had influenced reporting timelines. Performance incentives tied to trial success. A culture where speed was praised more than caution, and dissent was reframed as disloyalty. No single villain. No cinematic confession. Just a web of compromised decisions, each one easier to justify than the last. And yet, people had suffered. That truth sat at the center of every finding, impossible to ignore. The board issued a preliminary report weeks later. Carefully worded, legally cautious, but unmistakable. Protocol violations. Data misrepresentation. Failure to escalate patient safety concerns. The Prometheus trial was terminated. Not suspended. Terminated. Families were notified. Apologies were issued. Reviews were promised. And for the first time since this began, the hospital spoke publicly, not about innovation, not about prestige, but about accountability. Dr. Sharma and I stood side by side during the press briefing, not as heroes, not as rebels, but as professionals who had done what the role demanded when conscience and responsibility collided. Afterward, she turned to me and said quietly, "You were right. About all of it." I shook my head. "No," I said, "I was listening. That's what this had always been about. Listening to the nurses who stayed long after their shifts ended. Listening to patients who knew something was wrong long before charts reflected it. Listening to that still, unrelenting voice that doesn't let you sleep when injustice is nearby." St. Jude's didn't collapse. It recalibrated. New oversight structures were implemented. Ethics training became mandatory. Reporting channels were strengthened. None of it glamorous. None of it headline-worthy. But real change rarely is. And me? I stayed. Not because it was easy, but because this place still mattered. Because healing isn't just about medicine. It's about trust. And trust, once broken, has to be rebuilt by people willing to tell the truth even when it costs them. I learned something through all of this. Something I carry with me now like a compass. Power resists truth until truth becomes undeniable. Systems resist conscience until conscience becomes collective. And silence only wins when good people decide their voice isn't worth the trouble. Mine was. And if this story does anything, if it lingers, if it stirs, if it unsettles, let it be this reminder. You don't need permission to do what's right. You don't need a title to protect the vulnerable. And you don't need to shout when truth, patiently and persistently applied, can shake the very foundations of power. That is how reckoning begins. Not with noise, but with courage.